The dust rose in small clouds around her bleeding feet, and Dalton Nash felt something crack open inside his chest that had been sealed shut for the better part of 5 years. He pulled his horse to a stop on the rutted road outside Ouray, Colorado, watching the woman stumble forward through the July heat of 1878. Her dress hung in tatters, the pale blue fabric stained with dirt and what looked like dried blood. Long dark hair fell across her face, matted and tangled, and she swayed with each step like she might collapse at any moment. The sun beat down mercilessly on the high desert landscape, the San Juan Mountains rising in the distance like ancient sentinels keeping watch over the valley. Dalton dismounted quickly, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered from years of working his ranch, his face weathered by sun and wind. At 28, he had the look of someone who had seen too much hardship and not enough joy. His dark brown hair needed cutting, and a few days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw, but his green eyes were sharp and clear as he approached the struggling woman. "Madam," he called out, his voice rough from disuse. He lived alone on his ranch 5 miles outside town, and sometimes days passed without him speaking to another soul. "Madam, are you hurt?" She turned toward him, and he saw her face clearly for the first time. She could not have been more than 22 or 23, with delicate features that would have been beautiful if not marred by exhaustion and fear. Her eyes were a striking shade of blue-green, like the Colorado River on a clear day, and they fixed on him with a mixture of desperation and wariness. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Water." Dalton grabbed his canteen from his saddle and hurried to her side. She reached for it with trembling hands, but before she could grasp it, her knees buckled. He caught her before she hit the ground, one arm around her waist, steadying her against his chest. "Easy now," he said softly. "I have got you." He helped her drink, tilting the canteen carefully so she would not choke. She gulped the water desperately, some of it running down her chin. When she had drunk her fill, she sagged against him, barely able to stand. That was when he looked down and saw her feet. They were torn and bloody, the skin rubbed raw in places, cactus thorns embedded in others. His jaw tightened. Whatever had happened to this woman, she had walked a long way through unforgiving terrain. Without a word, Dalton sat her down gently in the shade of a scraggly juniper tree. He knelt before her and began unlacing his boots. They were good leather boots, barely a year old, made by a cobbler in Denver. He had paid more than he could afford for them, but they had been worth every penny. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You cannot walk another step like that," he said simply. He pulled off his boots and then his socks, setting them aside. The ground was hot beneath his bare feet, but he ignored the discomfort. "These will be too big for you, but they are better than nothing." Tears welled up in her eyes. "I cannot take your boots. You can and you will." His tone was gentle but firm. He carefully began removing the thorns from her feet, working as quickly and gently as he could. She flinched but did not cry out, biting her lower lip against the pain. When he had removed the worst of them, he pulled his socks onto her feet, then the boots. As he had suspected, they were far too large, but he laced them as tightly as he could. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked. "Eleanor," she said. "Eleanor Foster, Dalton Nash," he replied. "Can you tell me what happened to you?" Her face went pale and she looked away. "My husband," she started, then stopped. "My late husband and I were traveling to Silverton. We were ambushed 2 days ago. There were 3 men. They wanted our wagon, our supplies, everything. My husband tried to fight them." Her voice broke. "They shot him. I managed to run while they were busy with the wagon. I have been walking ever since." Dalton felt a surge of anger at the cruelty of it. The territory was full of desperate men, outlaws and bandits who preyed on travelers. It was one of the reasons he rarely left his ranch. "Where did this happen?" he asked. "I do not know exactly. Somewhere north of here. I just kept walking, trying to get away, trying to find help." She looked at him with those river-colored eyes. "You are the first person I have seen." Dalton stood and offered her his hand. "My ranch is about 5 miles from here. You can rest there, get cleaned up, have a proper meal. Tomorrow I will take you into town and we can talk to the sheriff about what happened." She took his hand and tried to stand, but her legs would not support her. The combination of exhaustion, dehydration, and shock had taken its toll. Without hesitation, Dalton bent and scooped her up into his arms. She weighed next to nothing, and he wondered when she had last eaten a decent meal. "I can walk," she protested weakly. "Maybe, but you do not have to." He carried her to his horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding named Rusty. Getting them both mounted was a bit of a challenge, but he managed, settling Eleanor in front of him in the saddle. She leaned back against his chest, and he could feel her trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. "I thought I was going to die out there." "You are safe now," he said, and he meant it. He clicked his tongue and urged Rusty forward, turning off the main road onto the track that led to his ranch. The horse moved at an easy walk, and Dalton kept one arm securely around Eleanor's waist to keep her steady. The sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The high desert was beautiful at this time of day, the harsh landscape softened by the golden light. Dalton had always loved this country, despite its harshness. It was honest land. It demanded everything from you and gave back only what you earned through hard work and determination. His ranch came into view after about 40 minutes of riding. It was not much to look at, just a simple house built of logs and stone, a barn, a few outbuildings and corrals for his cattle and horses. But it was his, built with his own hands over the past 5 years. After the war, after losing his family to cholera, after drifting aimlessly for months, he had come here and started over. The ranch had saved him, giving him purpose when he had none. Eleanor had dozed off against him, exhausted beyond endurance. He carried her into the house, careful not to wake her, and laid her on his bed. It was the only bed in the house, a simple frame with a corn husk mattress. He covered her with a quilt his mother had made years ago, one of the few possessions he had left from his old life. He stood looking down at her for a moment. Even filthy and exhausted, there was something about her that drew him. It was not just her beauty, though she was beautiful. It was something in her eyes, a strength that had kept her walking when most people would have laid down and died. Dalton shook his head and turned away. She was a widow, freshly grieving her husband, and she needed help, not some lonely rancher mooning over her. He went outside and tended to Rusty, removing the saddle and brushing him down before turning him into the corral. Then he drew water from the well and heated it on the stove, filling a basin so Eleanor could wash when she woke. The sun had fully set by the time he heard movement from inside the house. He had been sitting on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Colorado sky. He stood and went inside. Eleanor was sitting up in bed, looking around with confusion. When she saw him in the doorway, memory flooded back into her face, along with a mixture of relief and something that might have been embarrassment. "I fell asleep," she said. "You needed it." He gestured to the basin of warm water on the table, along with soap and clean cloths. "I thought you might want to wash up. I do not have much in the way of women's clothing, but I found an old shirt and some pants that might work for now. They will be too big, but better than what you are wearing." She looked down at her ruined dress and nodded. "Thank you. You have been incredibly kind to me, Mr. Nash." "Dalton," he corrected. "And it is just common decency. Any man worth his salt would do the same." I have known plenty of men who would not have, she said quietly. Plenty who would have seen an opportunity rather than someone in need of help. The truth of that statement hung in the air between them. Dalton nodded slowly. I will be outside. Take your time. When you are ready, I will fix us some supper. He stepped out onto the porch again, giving her privacy. The night air was cool, a relief after the heat of the day. He could hear small animals moving in the brush, the distant call of an owl. This was usually his favorite time of day, when the work was done and he could sit in the peace and quiet. But tonight, his mind was racing. Who was Eleanor Foster really? Where had she come from? The story about her husband's death rang true, but there was something in her eyes that suggested there was more to it. Not that he blamed her for keeping secrets. Everyone had them, himself included. About 20 minutes later, the door opened and Eleanor emerged. She had washed her face and arms, and her hair was wet, combed back from her face. She wore his old shirt, the sleeves rolled up several times, and a pair of his pants held up with a length of rope as a belt. She was still wearing his boots. Despite the ill-fitting clothes, or perhaps because of them, she looked younger and more vulnerable. Better, he asked. She nodded. Much better, thank you. Hungry, starving, he smiled, a rare expression that felt strange on his face. Come on then. I am not much of a cook, but I can manage bacon and beans and cornbread. They went inside, and Dalton busied himself at the stove while Eleanor sat at the small table. The house was simple, just one main room that served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room, with a small bedroom area curtained off at one end. It was clean but sparse, containing only the essentials. How long have you lived here? Eleanor asked. 5 years. Built most of it myself. It is a good house. He glanced at her, surprised by the warmth in her voice. Most women would have found it rough and lacking in comforts. It suits me. Do you run cattle and horses? I have about 200 head of cattle and maybe 20 horses. It is not a big operation, but it is enough for one man to handle. You have no help, no ranch hands. Cannot afford them. I do all the work myself. He set a plate in front of her, piled with bacon, beans, and a thick slice of cornbread. It is not fancy. It is perfect. She picked up her fork and began eating, trying to maintain her manners but clearly ravenous. He sat across from her with his own plate and ate in silence, watching her covertly. When she had finished, she sat back with a sigh. That was the best meal I have had in weeks. Weeks? He asked, surprised. But you said you and your husband were traveling. She looked down at her empty plate, a shadow crossing her face. We were not traveling in comfort. Money was tight. We were heading to Silverton because my husband had heard there was work in the mines. We had been on the road for almost a month, camping rough, rationing our supplies. Where did you come from originally? Kansas. A little town called Abilene. She met his eyes. My husband was not a bad man, but he had bad luck. Everything he touched seemed to fail. We lost our farm when the grasshoppers came 3 years ago. After that, we just drifted, looking for something better that never seemed to come. I am sorry for your loss, Dalton said, meaning it. She nodded slowly. I am sorry too, not just for his death, but for the life we had. We married young, too young maybe. I was 18 and he was 20. We thought love would be enough, but it turned out love does not fill your belly or put a roof over your head. She looked up at him. I should not be speaking ill of him. He is barely 2 days in the ground. We barely buried him, Dalton asked gently. I could not leave him for the animals. I dragged him off the road and covered him with rocks as best I could. I said a prayer. Her voice broke. It was not much of a burial, but it was all I could manage. Dalton reached across the table and briefly covered her hand with his. You did what you could under impossible circumstances. That is all anyone can ask. Tears spilled down her cheeks and she wiped them away roughly. I am sorry. I do not mean to fall apart. You have earned the right to fall apart, but you are safe here. Tomorrow we will go into town and sort things out. For tonight, just rest. I cannot take your bed again. Where will you sleep? I have blankets. I will sleep on the floor out here. It will not be the first time. She looked like she wanted to argue, but exhaustion was winning. He showed her to the bed again, and this time she did not protest. Within minutes of lying down, she was asleep. Dalton sat by the fire for a long time, thinking. He told himself he was just being a good Christian, helping someone in need. But there was no denying the pull he felt toward Eleanor Foster. It was more than attraction, though he would have been lying if he said she was not attractive. It was something deeper, a recognition of a kindred spirit. She had been through hardship and loss, just as he had. She had survived when survival seemed impossible. He finally spread his blankets on the floor and lay down, but sleep was slow in coming. His mind kept circling back to the woman sleeping in his bed, and to the dangerous territory his thoughts were treading. She was newly widowed, vulnerable, and dependent on him for help. The last thing he should be thinking about was how right she had felt in his arms when he had carried her. Morning came too quickly. Dalton woke to find sunlight streaming through the windows and the smell of coffee in the air. He sat up, disoriented, and saw Eleanor at the stove, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. "I hope you do not mind," she said. "I woke early and could not get back to sleep. I found your coffee and figured I should make myself useful." He stood and stretched, his back protesting from the hard floor. "I do not mind at all." She handed him a cup, and their fingers brushed. The contact sent a jolt through him that he tried to ignore. "How are your feet this morning?" "Sore but better. The boots helped a lot." She paused. "I do not know how I will ever repay you for your kindness." "You do not need to repay anything." He took a sip of the coffee. It was good, better than he usually made. "But we should head into town soon. The sheriff needs to know about what happened, and we should see if there is anything that can be done." Eleanor's face grew troubled. "What will happen to me? I have no money, no family, nowhere to go." It was the question Dalton had been avoiding thinking about. In 1878 Colorado, a woman alone with no resources had few good options. She could try to find work as a seamstress or laundress, but jobs were scarce, and the pay was barely enough to survive on. Some women ended up in brothels, not by choice but by desperation. The thought of Eleanor being forced into such circumstances made his stomach turn. "We will figure something out," he said, though he had no idea what. "First things first. Let us go talk to the sheriff." They ate a quick breakfast of leftover cornbread and then prepared to leave for town. Dalton hitched up his wagon rather than riding, figuring Eleanor would be more comfortable that way. He helped her up onto the seat, and they set off down the rutted track toward Ouray. The town of Ouray sat nestled in a valley surrounded by the San Juan Mountains, their peaks still tipped with snow even in July. It was a mining town, grown prosperous from the silver mines that dotted the surrounding hills. The main street was lined with buildings of rough-hewn wood and stone, including a general store, a bank, 3 saloons, a hotel, a boarding house, and the sheriff's office. Dalton pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the sheriff's office and helped Eleanor down. Her hand trembled slightly in his, and he gave it a reassuring squeeze before letting go. Sheriff Tom Garrett was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a thick mustache and shrewd eyes. He looked up from his desk as they entered, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern when he saw Eleanor's condition. "Dalton," he greeted, "what brings you to town? And who is this young lady?" "Sheriff, this is Mrs. Eleanor Foster. She and her husband were ambushed a couple days north of here. Her husband was killed and she has been walking ever since. I found her on the road yesterday." The sheriff's expression grew grim. "Ambushed, you say? Can you describe what happened, madam? Eleanor recounted the story, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. She described the three men as best she could, though she had not gotten a good look at their faces. They had taken everything, the wagon, the horses, all their supplies and belongings. The sheriff took notes, nodding gravely. I will send word to the surrounding towns, see if anyone has seen these men or your wagon, he said when she had finished. But I will be honest with you, madam. Odds of recovering your property are slim. Men like that move fast and cover their tracks. I understand, Eleanor said quietly. I just want them caught so they cannot do this to anyone else. We will do our best. The sheriff turned to Dalton. Where is Mrs. Foster staying? She spent last night at my ranch, Dalton said, aware of how that might sound. I will figure out something more permanent shortly. The sheriff's eyebrows rose slightly, but he was too professional to comment. The boarding house has rooms available. Mrs. Chen runs a respectable establishment. I have no money for a boarding house, Eleanor said softly. I have nothing at all. An awkward silence fell. Dalton could see the sheriff doing calculations in his head, trying to figure out what could be done for a destitute widow. The town had no formal charity, and while the church might help for a few days, they could not support her indefinitely. She can stay at my ranch for now, Dalton heard himself say. Just until she gets on her feet. Both Eleanor and the sheriff looked at him in surprise. Eleanor's cheeks flushed. I cannot impose on you like that. You would not be imposing. The ranch is big enough for 2 people, and Lord knows I could use help around the place. You could earn your keep doing cooking and such, if it would make you feel better about it. Dalton, the sheriff said carefully, you know how people might talk about a single woman staying with a single man. Let them talk, Dalton said, a hard edge creeping into his voice. I am offering practical help to someone in need. Anyone who wants to make something dirty out of that can go to hell. Mr. Nash, Eleanor said softly. I appreciate the offer, truly I do, but the sheriff is right. I do not want to damage your reputation. Dalton looked at her, seeing the pride struggling with desperation in her eyes. He understood that pride. It was all she had left. How about this? He said. You stay at the ranch for a few weeks. Help with the cooking and cleaning and such, and in return I will pay you a wage. Enough that you can save up for a train ticket or a stake to start fresh somewhere. That makes it a proper employment arrangement, not charity. Eleanor bit her lip, clearly torn. Are you sure? I am sure. She took a deep breath and nodded. Then I accept. Thank you, Mr. Nash. I promise I will work hard and not be a burden. I have no doubt of that. He turned to the sheriff. If you hear anything about those bandits, let me know. I will. You two be careful out there. They left the office and walked back to the wagon. Dalton could feel eyes on them from up and down the street. News traveled fast in a small town, and he had no doubt that by nightfall everyone in our array would know about the widow staying at his ranch. He found he did not much care. We should get you some proper clothes, he said, and shoes that actually fit. I cannot afford it, Eleanor protested. Consider it an advance on your wages. He steered her toward the general store before she could argue further. The general store was dim and cool inside, smelling of coffee, leather, and pickles. Mrs. Henderson, the proprietor's wife, looked up from behind the counter, her eyes widening with interest when she saw Dalton with a woman. Morning, Mrs. Henderson, Dalton said. This is Mrs. Foster. She is going to be working at my ranch for a while, and she needs some proper clothes and supplies. Mrs. Henderson's expression was a mix of curiosity and barely concealed judgment, but she was too good a businesswoman to turn away a sale. Of course. Right this way, dear. She led Eleanor to the section of the store that held ready-made dresses, undergarments, and other necessities. Dalton wandered over to look at tools and equipment, trying to give them privacy. but he could not help glancing over occasionally, watching as Eleanor held up a simple calico dress, her expression wistful. When they finally approached the counter with their purchases, including 2 dresses, undergarments, a nightgown, a pair of women's boots, and various other necessities, Dalton did not even flinch at the total. It would take a chunk out of his savings, but it was worth it. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered as they loaded the packages into the wagon. "I will pay you back every penny, I promise. I am not worried about it." He helped her up onto the wagon seat and climbed up beside her. "We should get back, the cattle need checking." The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the trip into town. Eleanor seemed lost in thought, occasionally touching the packages beside her as if to reassure herself they were real. Dalton let her be, understanding that she needed time to process everything that had happened. When they arrived back at the ranch, Dalton unhitched the wagon while Eleanor took her new belongings inside. He found her standing in the middle of the main room, looking uncertain. "You can have the bedroom," he said. "I will sleep out here. And before you argue, I am bigger and it makes no sense for you to be cramped up on the floor when there is a perfectly good bed you can use." "This does not seem right," she said. "You are giving up so much." "I am gaining a cook," he said with a slight smile. "Trust me, that is worth any inconvenience. My cooking is barely fit for human consumption." She laughed, a surprised sound that seemed to startle her as much as it did him. "You are exaggerating. The meal you made last night was fine." "That is about the extent of my skills." "Bacon, beans, and cornbread. Sometimes I throw in fried potatoes if I am feeling ambitious. Then I definitely need to earn my keep." She looked around the kitchen area. "What do you have in the way of supplies?" They spent the next hour taking stock of his pantry, which was admittedly sparse. He had the basics: flour, cornmeal, salt, sugar, coffee, dried beans, bacon, and some canned goods. Not much to work with, but Eleanor seemed pleased. "I can make do with this," she said. "Though we should get some chickens. Fresh eggs would be nice, and I could bake proper cakes and such." "Chickens," Dalton repeated as if it was a foreign concept. "You do not have chickens." "Never seemed worth the trouble for just me." "Well, it is not just you anymore." She said it matter-of-factly, but something about the statement made his heart beat faster. "At least not for now. We should also think about a garden. It is late in the season, but we could still get some vegetables in the ground." Dalton found himself nodding along, drawn in by her enthusiasm. It had been years since he had thought about things like chickens and gardens. He had been focused solely on survival, on building his herd and keeping his ranch afloat. He had forgotten about the small things that made a house a home. "We can go back into town next week and get what you need," he said. "But right now, I need to ride out and check on the cattle." "Will you be all right here alone?" "Of course. I am not helpless, Mr. Nash." "Dalton," he corrected again. "And I did not think you were helpless, just making sure you are comfortable." "I will be fine. Go do what you need to do." He saddled Rusty and rode out to check his herd, but his mind was not fully on his work. He kept thinking about Eleanor back at the house, about how she had looked when she laughed, about how right it felt to have someone to come home to. He had been alone for so long that he had forgotten what it was like to have companionship. When he returned to the ranch as the sun was setting, he was greeted by the smell of something wonderful cooking. He put Rusty away and washed up at the pump before heading inside. Eleanor had transformed his simple pantry into a feast. There was fried chicken, biscuits, gravy, and greens. The table was set properly with the tin plates and cups arranged neatly. "Where did the chicken come from?" he asked, amazed. "I found it in your coop," she said. "I do not have a coop." She smiled. "You had a wild chicken living in your barn. I caught it. I figured you would not miss it." Dalton laughed, a real laugh, the sound rusty from disuse. I did not even know there was a chicken in my barn. There were two, actually. I left the other one. I thought maybe I could catch it tomorrow and we could start that coop." They sat down to eat, and Dalton thought he had never tasted anything so good in his life. It was not just the food, though that was excellent. It was the act of sitting down to a proper meal with someone else, of having conversation and company. "Tell me about yourself," Eleanor said as they ate. "How did you end up out here?" Dalton was quiet for a moment, trying to decide how much to share. "I grew up in Missouri. During the war, I fought for the Union. When I came home, my family was gone. Cholera had taken them all, my parents and my two sisters. After that, I just drifted for a while, eventually ended up out here and decided to start over." "I am sorry about your family," Eleanor said softly. "That must have been terrible. It was a long time ago." He took a sip of coffee. "What about you? You said you were from Kansas, born and raised in Abilene." "My parents ran a boarding house. I met James, my husband, when he came through town looking for work. We married too quickly before we really knew each other. I thought I loved him, and maybe I did in a way, but it was not enough to build a life on." "You have family back in Kansas?" She shook her head. "My parents died 2 years ago within 6 months of each other. I have no siblings. James was all I had, and now he is gone too." They were both orphans in their own way, Dalton realized. Both alone in the world, both trying to make their way through a harsh and unforgiving landscape. The days settled into a rhythm after that. Dalton would rise before dawn and head out to tend his cattle and horses, checking fences, moving the herd to fresh grazing, breaking young horses. Eleanor would spend her days cooking, cleaning, mending his clothes, and slowly transforming the house into something more livable. She found curtains in town and hung them at the windows. She planted a small garden near the house, coaxing vegetables from the hard soil. And somehow, she managed to catch that second wild chicken and start a small flock. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch after supper, watching the sun set behind the mountains. They talked about everything and nothing, their lives, their dreams, their regrets. Dalton found himself opening up to her in ways he had never opened up to anyone. She had a way of listening that made him feel heard, understood. "Do you ever get lonely out here?" Eleanor asked one evening about 2 weeks after she had arrived. "I did," Dalton admitted, "but I told myself I preferred it, that I was better off alone. And now—" He looked at her, at the way the fading light caught in her hair, at the small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Now I am not so sure." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition of the feelings that had been growing steadily since the day he had found her walking barefoot in the dust. But neither of them acted on it. Eleanor was still in mourning, technically, though Dalton suspected her grief was more complicated than simple loss. And he was afraid of ruining the fragile connection they had built, afraid of being hurt again. But the feelings would not be ignored forever. About a month after Eleanor had come to stay, Dalton was working on repairing the barn roof when a sudden thunderstorm blew in from the mountains. The sky went dark in minutes, and rain began pouring down in sheets. He climbed down from the roof, soaked through, and ran for the house. Eleanor met him at the door with a towel. "You are drenched," she said, laughing. "Get those wet clothes off before you catch your death." He stripped off his shirt, suddenly very aware of her eyes on him. She blushed and turned away, busying herself at the stove. "I made stew," she said. "It should be ready soon." Dalton dried off and changed into clean clothes, but the awareness between them remained. All through dinner, he was conscious of every movement she made, every glance she threw his way. The storm raged outside, rattling the windows, but inside the small house felt warm and safe and charged with something electric. After they had eaten and cleaned up, They sat by the fire. Rain drummed on the roof, and lightning occasionally flickered through the windows. Eleanor was mending one of his shirts, her needle flashing in the firelight. Dalton was pretending to read an old newspaper, but his eyes kept drifting to her. "Dalton," she said suddenly, setting down her sewing, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you really offer to let me stay here? The truth." He set down the newspaper and met her eyes. "Because when I saw you walking barefoot in that dust, looking like you were about to give up, something inside me woke up, something I thought had died years ago." "What was it?" she whispered. "Hope," he said simply. "Hope that maybe I did not have to be alone forever. Hope that maybe there was still good in the world worth fighting for." Eleanor's eyes glistened with tears. "I felt something too that first day. When you gave me your boots, when you carried me like I was something precious instead of a burden. No one had treated me like that in so long." "Your husband?" Dalton asked carefully. She shook her head. "James was not a bad man, but he was not a good man either. He was careless with people's feelings, including mine. Toward the end, I think we both realized we had made a mistake, but we were stuck with each other. When he died, I felt guilty because mixed in with the grief was relief. You should not feel guilty for that, but I do." She wiped at her eyes. "What kind of person does that make me? An honest one?" Dalton moved to sit beside her on the small sofa. "Eleanor, you have been through hell. You are allowed to have complicated feelings about it." She turned to look at him, and suddenly they were very close. He could see the flecks of green in her blue eyes, could smell the lavender soap she used. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. "Dalton," she breathed. He cupped her face in his hand, his calloused thumb brushing across her cheek. "Tell me to stop if you do not want this." "I do not want you to stop." He kissed her then, gently at first, testing. She responded immediately, her hand coming up to rest on his chest, over his racing heart. The kiss deepened, all the longing and loneliness of the past weeks pouring into it. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. "I am falling in love with you," Dalton said. "I know it is too soon, I know you are not ready, but I cannot help it." "It is not too soon," Eleanor said. "I am falling in love with you too. Maybe I have been since the moment you took off your boots for me. No one had ever done something like that before, something so simple and yet so profound." They sat together by the fire, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her, listening to the storm. Dalton felt a peace he had not known in years. The ghosts that had haunted him for so long finally seemed to quiet. He had found something worth more than all the cattle and land in Colorado. He had found someone to share his life with. But happiness in the West was never simple, and their peace was not to last long. A week later, Dalton was in town picking up supplies when Sheriff Garrett pulled him aside. "Dalton, I need to talk to you about Mrs. Foster," the sheriff said, his expression serious. "What about her?" "I have been doing some checking, sending telegrams to Kansas and such. There are some things about her story that do not quite add up." Dalton felt his stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" "Well, for one thing, I cannot find any record of a James Foster dying on the road between here and Silverton. And I talked to the sheriff up in Silverton. He has not heard anything about any ambush." "Maybe the body has not been found yet," Dalton said, but doubt was creeping in. "Maybe," the sheriff said, "but there is more. I got a telegram back from the sheriff in Abilene, Kansas. There was a Eleanor Foster living there, daughter of the couple who ran the boarding house, just like she said. But according to their records, her husband James Foster died 3 years ago, not 3 weeks ago. And the cause of death was not gunshot, it was influenza." Dalton felt like he had been punched in the gut. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that Mrs. Foster might not be telling you the whole truth about her situation. Now, I am not accusing her of anything criminal, mind you, but I think there is more to her story than what she has shared." Dalton thanked the sheriff and left, his mind reeling. He drove the wagon back to the ranch in a daze, trying to make sense of what he had learned. Why would Eleanor lie about her husband's death? What was she running from? When he arrived home, he found Eleanor in the garden, tending to the vegetables. She looked up with a smile when she heard the wagon, but the smile faded when she saw his expression. "What is wrong?" she asked. "We need to talk." He climbed down from the wagon. "Inside." She followed him into the house, worry etched on her face. Dalton set down the supplies and turned to face her. "The sheriff did some checking on your story. He says there is no record of any ambush, no body found. And he says your husband James died 3 years ago of influenza, not 3 weeks ago." The color drained from Eleanor's face. She sat down heavily at the table, her hands trembling. "He found out, so it is true. You lied to me." Dalton tried to keep the hurt from his voice but failed. "Yes," she whispered. "I lied, but please let me explain. I am listening." Eleanor took a deep breath. "James did die 3 years ago, just like the sheriff said. After he died, I was alone with no money and no prospects. I tried to make it work in Abilene, taking in laundry and sewing, but it was not enough. Then a man started coming around, Calvin Foster, James's brother. He said I should marry him, that it was the proper thing to do, that he would take care of me. But you did not want to marry him. No, Calvin was cruel. He drank and he had a mean temper. I had seen the bruises on James's mother, had heard the stories. I knew what my life would be if I married him, but he would not take no for an answer. He started making threats, saying he would ruin my reputation, make sure I could not find work anywhere. So I ran. Where have you been for the past 3 years? Drifting, just like I said. Working when I could, moving on when I had to. I have been to Kansas City, Denver, Pueblo, always looking over my shoulder, afraid Calvin would find me. About a month ago, I was in Silverton, working as a seamstress. Calvin tracked me down. He cornered me one night and said he was taking me back to Abilene whether I liked it or not. So you ran again. She nodded. I left everything and just ran. I walked for 2 days straight, trying to get as far away as possible. My shoes fell apart. My feet were torn to pieces. I thought I was going to die out there, and then you found me." She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "I lied about the ambush because I was afraid if you knew the truth, you would send me away. I am sorry, Dalton. I am so sorry. I never meant to deceive you." Dalton was quiet for a long time, processing everything she had told him. He understood why she had lied. She had been desperate, alone, and terrified, but it still hurt that she had not trusted him with the truth. "Is there anything else you are not telling me?" he asked finally. "No." "I swear, that is everything." He walked to the window and looked out at his ranch, at the land he had built from nothing. He thought about the past weeks with Eleanor, how happy he had been, how alive he had felt. Could he walk away from that because she had lied to protect herself? "I wish you had told me the truth from the beginning," he said. "I would have helped you either way." "I know that now," Eleanor said, "but I did not know it then. All I knew was that every man I had ever trusted had let me down or hurt me. I had no reason to think you would be any different." Dalton turned to face her. "And now I know you are different. You are kind and good and decent. You are the best man I have ever known, and I love you, Dalton Nash. I love you so much it terrifies me." He crossed the room and pulled her to her feet, wrapping his arms around her. She buried her face in his chest, sobbing. He held her tight, feeling his own eyes burn with tears. "I love you too," he said roughly. "And I am not going to let anyone take you away. If this Calvin shows up here, he will have to go through me." She looked up at him. "You mean it?" "Even after I lied, even after you lied, I understand why you did it. I do not like it, but I understand." He cupped her face in his hands. "No more secrets between us from now on." "Deal, deal," she whispered. He kissed her then, a kiss that sealed the promise between them. When they pulled apart, Eleanor was smiling through her tears. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Now we go see the sheriff and tell him the truth. We explain the situation and make sure if this Calvin does come looking for you, the law will be on our side." They went into town the next day and told Sheriff Garrett everything. The sheriff listened carefully, taking notes, his expression grave. "I will send a telegram to Abilene. Let them know you are here of your own free will, and that Calvin Foster has no legal claim on you," he said when Eleanor had finished. "If he shows up here, I will make sure he understands that." "Thank you, Sheriff," Eleanor said. "I have to say, though, Mrs. Foster, it would be better if you had some legal protection. If you were married to Dalton here, for instance, there would not be much Calvin could do." Dalton and Eleanor looked at each other. They had not talked about marriage yet, though it had been on both their minds. "That is something we will need to discuss," Dalton said carefully. They left the sheriff's office and walked back to the wagon. Eleanor was quiet, and Dalton could sense her thinking. "I do not want you to feel pressured," she said finally. "I know the sheriff meant well, but you should not have to marry me just to keep me safe." "What if I want to marry you anyway?" Dalton asked. "Not just to keep you safe, but because I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Eleanor stopped walking and turned to face him. "Do you mean that?" "I do." He took her hands in his. "Eleanor Foster, I know we have not known each other long, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to build a life with you, have children with you, grow old with you. Will you marry me?" Tears spilled down her cheeks again, but she was smiling. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married 2 weeks later by the circuit preacher who came through our A. It was a simple ceremony, held at the ranch with just a few witnesses: Sheriff Garrett, Mrs. Henderson from the general store, and a couple of neighboring ranchers. Eleanor wore one of the calico dresses Dalton had bought her, and she had woven wildflowers into her hair. Dalton wore his best shirt and pants, his hair freshly cut. As they said their vows, Dalton felt a sense of rightness settle over him. This was where he was meant to be, with this woman by his side. Eleanor's hand trembled in his as he slid the simple gold band onto her finger, but her voice was steady as she pledged to love and honor him. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Dalton kissed her to the applause of their small audience. The sun was shining, the mountains stood tall and strong in the distance, and everything felt possible. They had a celebration afterward, with food Eleanor had spent days preparing and whiskey for the men. As the sun began to set, the guests departed, leaving Dalton and Eleanor alone for the first time as husband and wife. "Mrs. Nash," Dalton said, pulling her into his arms. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Eleanor said, wrapping her arms around his neck. "So do I." That night, they came together as man and wife, and Dalton felt like all the broken pieces of his life finally clicked into place. Eleanor was his, and he was hers, bound together not just by law but by love. The next months were the happiest Dalton had ever known. The ranch flourished under their combined efforts. Eleanor's garden produced abundantly, and her chicken flock grew. Dalton's cattle herd increased, and he was able to hire on a young ranch hand to help with the work. The house became a home, filled with laughter and warmth. Winter came early that year, with snow blanketing the valley by October. Dalton and Eleanor spent the long evenings by the fire, talking and dreaming about the future. It was during one of those evenings that Eleanor told him she was expecting a baby. "Are you sure?" Dalton asked, his voice full of wonder. "I am sure," she said, placing his hand on her still flat stomach. The baby should come sometime in May. Dalton felt tears prick his eyes. A baby. He was going to be a father. After all the loss and loneliness, life was giving him this incredible gift. "I love you," he said, pulling her close. "I love you so much." "I love you too," she whispered. The winter passed slowly, but Dalton did not mind. He used the time to prepare for the baby, building a cradle from wood he had been saving, making sure the house was warm and secure. Eleanor knitted tiny clothes and blankets, her hands never idle. Spring came late, but when it finally arrived, it brought new life to the valley. The snow melted, revealing the green grass beneath. Calves were born in the pastures, filling the air with their calls. And then, on a warm day in May, Eleanor went into labor. It was a long and difficult birth. Dalton sent for the midwife from town, Mrs. Chen, who had delivered dozens of babies. She arrived and took charge, shooing Dalton outside while she tended to Eleanor. He paced on the porch, listening to Eleanor's cries, feeling helpless and terrified. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he heard a different cry, the thin, reedy wail of a newborn. Mrs. Chen opened the door, smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Nash, a healthy baby boy. And your wife is fine, just exhausted." Dalton rushed inside to find Eleanor propped up in bed, her hair damp with sweat, but smiling. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. He approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe. "Meet your son," Eleanor said softly. Dalton looked down at the baby and felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. The baby had a shock of dark hair and tiny perfect features. His eyes were closed, his mouth working as he made small sounds. "He is perfect," Dalton whispered. "What should we name him?" "I was thinking Daniel," Eleanor said. "Daniel Nash, if you like it." "Daniel," Dalton repeated. He gently touched his son's tiny hand, and the baby's fingers curled around his. "Hello, Daniel, I am your father." Life fell into a new rhythm after Daniel's birth. The days were full of work, and the nights broken by feedings and diaper changes. But Dalton had never been happier. Watching Eleanor with their son, seeing the love and tenderness in her eyes, made him fall in love with her all over again every day. Daniel thrived. He grew quickly, from a tiny newborn into a chubby, smiling baby. He had his mother's blue-green eyes and his father's dark hair. Dalton would spend hours just watching him, marveling at the miracle of his existence. When Daniel was about 6 months old, a stranger rode up to the ranch. Dalton was working in the barn when Eleanor called out to him, her voice tight with fear. He grabbed his rifle and hurried outside to find a man on horseback, dusty from travel, watching the house. "Can I help you?" Dalton called out, his rifle held loosely but ready. The man was in his mid-30s with thinning brown hair and a hard face. "I am looking for Eleanor Foster," he said. "I heard she might be here." Dalton's grip on the rifle tightened. "Who is asking?" "Name is Calvin Foster. Eleanor is my sister-in-law." I have been looking for her for a long time, so he had finally come. Dalton had known this day might arrive, but he had hoped they would be spared. "Eleanor Nash lives here," Dalton said, emphasizing her married name. "She is my wife, and she does not want to see you." Calvin's eyes narrowed. "That is for her to say, not you." "Actually, it is for me to say. This is my land and you are not welcome here. I suggest you turn around and ride back wherever you came from." "I just want to talk to her," Calvin said, but there was something oily in his tone that set Dalton's teeth on edge. "Is that too much to ask?" Eleanor stepped out onto the porch, Daniel in her arms. "I have nothing to say to you, Calvin. Go away." Calvin dismounted, and Dalton immediately stepped between him and Eleanor, raising the rifle. "That is close enough." "Eleanor, please," Calvin said, trying to look around Dalton. "I came all this way just to find you. I worried about you. When you disappeared, I thought something terrible had happened." "You mean you worried that I had escaped you?" Eleanor said coldly. "I know what you wanted, Calvin, and I would rather die than be tied to you." "That is harsh," Calvin said. "I only ever wanted to help you. You were alone and struggling. I offered to take care of you." "You offered to own me," Eleanor corrected. "There is a difference." Calvin's expression hardened. "You always were ungrateful. My brother was too soft on you, but I see you have done just fine for yourself, finding another man to latch onto." Dalton took a step forward, his rifle now pointed directly at Calvin's chest. "You need to leave. Now. Before I lose my patience." "Or what? You will shoot me," Calvin sneered. "I do not think so. The law would not take kindly to that." "The law would not take kindly to you harassing my wife either," Dalton said. "Sheriff Garrett knows all about you, Calvin. He knows how you have been chasing Eleanor, threatening her. If anything happens to her or to me, you will be the first person he looks at." Calvin stood there for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he spat on the ground and turned back to his horse. "This is not over, Eleanor. You belonged to a Foster once, and in my mind you still do." "I belong to myself," Eleanor said, "and to the man I choose to be with. You have no claim on me, and you never did." Calvin mounted his horse and rode off without another word. Dalton kept the rifle trained on him until he was out of sight. Only then did he lower it and turn to Eleanor. She was trembling, holding Daniel close. "It is all right," Dalton said, climbing the porch steps and wrapping his free arm around both of them. "He is gone. What if he comes back?" Eleanor asked. "Then I will be ready for him, but I do not think he will. He is a bully, and bullies back down when someone stands up to them." Dalton was right. They never saw Calvin Foster again. A few months later, they heard through the grapevine that he had returned to Kansas and married a widow there, someone he could control. Eleanor breathed a sigh of relief, and the shadow that had been hanging over them finally lifted. The years passed peacefully after that. Daniel grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved the ranch and everything about it. When he was 3, Eleanor became pregnant again. This time, the birth was easier, and they welcomed a daughter they named Emma, with Eleanor's coloring and Dalton's quiet nature. The ranch prospered. Dalton was able to expand his herd and buy more land. He hired on 2 full-time ranch hands, and they built a new barn and expanded the house. Eleanor's garden became famous in the area, and she sold her surplus vegetables in town. The chickens multiplied, and they added pigs and a milk cow. Life was not always easy. There were droughts and harsh winters, times when money was tight and the work seemed endless. But they faced everything together, and that made all the difference. Dalton would look at his wife across the dinner table, surrounded by their children, and marvel at how his life had turned out. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, they would sit on the porch as they had in the early days, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Dalton would take Eleanor's hand, still rough from work but dear to him beyond measure. "Do you ever think about that day I found you?" he would ask. "All the time," she would answer. "I think about how I was ready to give up, and then you appeared like some kind of miracle." "You were the miracle," he would say. "You saved me as much as I saved you." When Daniel was 10 and Emma was 7, Eleanor became pregnant one last time. At 34, she was nervous about having another baby, but the pregnancy went smoothly. In the spring of 1892, they welcomed twin boys, Matthew and Marcus. The house was suddenly very full and very loud, but Dalton loved every chaotic moment. As the children grew, Dalton taught them everything he knew about ranching. Daniel took to it naturally, already showing signs of being a skilled horseman and cattleman. Emma preferred helping her mother with the garden and the household, but she was equally at home on a horse when needed. The twins were still young, but they followed their older siblings around, eager to be part of everything. The ranch that Dalton had built alone became a family enterprise. They worked together, building something that would last for generations. Dalton made sure the children understood that the land was a gift, one that required care and respect. On quiet nights, after the children were in bed, Dalton and Eleanor would finally have time to themselves. They would sit together, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting on his chest, and talk about their day, their dreams, their hopes for the children. "I never imagined I could be this happy," Eleanor said one night. "After everything that happened, after all the hard times, I never thought I would find this kind of peace." "Neither did I," Dalton admitted. "I thought I was done with life, that I would just exist until I died. And then I saw you walking barefoot in that dust, and everything changed." "You changed my life that day," Eleanor said. "You gave me your boots, carried me home, gave me a place to belong. You gave me everything." "You gave me just as much," Dalton said. "You gave me a reason to live again. You gave me love and family and joy. You made my house into a home." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the night. An owl called from somewhere in the darkness. A coyote yipped in the distance. These were the sounds Dalton had grown to love over the years, the soundtrack of his life. The children grew and the years continued to pass. Daniel eventually took over most of the day-to-day running of the ranch, allowing Dalton to slow down a bit. Emma married a young man from town, a lawyer's son, and they built a house on the edge of the ranch property. The twins showed promise of being as good at ranching as their older brother. Dalton and Eleanor grew older together, their hair turning gray, their movements slowing, but their love never diminishing. They had weathered storms, both literal and figurative, had faced down threats and overcome obstacles, and they had done it all together. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration. The house was full of noise and laughter, just as Dalton had always dreamed it would be. Emma had brought her 3 children, and Daniel's wife was expecting their 4th. As Dalton looked around at his family, at the legacy he and Eleanor had built together, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. Life had given him more than he ever deserved or expected. It had given him Eleanor, and from that one act of kindness on a dusty road, everything else had flowed. That evening, after everyone had gone home and they were alone again, Eleanor came to sit beside him on the porch. She took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About how lucky I am," Dalton said. "About how one decision, one moment of compassion changed everything." "It was not just luck," Eleanor said. "It was you. You saw someone in need and you helped without asking for anything in return. That is who you are, Dalton Nash. That is who you have always been." "And you," he said, turning to look at her. Her hair was silver now, her face lined with age, but to him she was as beautiful as the day he had first seen her. "You are the bravest, strongest person I have ever known. You survived things that would have broken most people. You built a life out of nothing. You are extraordinary." "We are extraordinary together," Eleanor corrected with a smile. "Neither of us could have done this alone." "No," Dalton agreed. "We could not have. But together we built something beautiful." They sat together as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red and purple. The mountains stood eternal in the distance, silent witnesses to their story. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour. The chickens settled in for the night with quiet clucks. A horse whinnied softly in the corral. These were the sounds of home, of a life well lived, of love that had endured. Dalton pulled Eleanor closer, and she rested her head on his shoulder, just as she had done countless times over the past 30 years. "I love you," he said softly. "I love you too," she replied. "Always and forever." As darkness fell over the valley and stars began to emerge in the vast Colorado sky, Dalton Nash felt complete. The lonely rancher who had once thought his life was over had found not just love, but purpose, family, and joy beyond measure. And it had all started with a simple act of kindness on a dusty road, when he had seen a woman walking barefoot and given her his boots. Years continued to roll by, gentle and steady like the seasons. Dalton and Eleanor settled into the comfortable rhythm of grandparents, their days filled with the simple pleasures of tending Eleanor's garden, watching their grandchildren play, and enjoying the peace they had earned through decades of hard work. Daniel proved to be an excellent rancher, expanding the operation with careful planning and modern techniques while still respecting the traditions his father had taught him. The Nash Ranch became one of the most successful in the region, known for quality cattle and honest dealings. Emma's children would visit often, and Eleanor delighted in teaching them to cook and garden, passing down the skills that had served her so well. The twins, now grown men themselves, had both married and were talking about starting their own ranching operations nearby, wanting to stay close to family. On his 60th birthday, Dalton stood on his porch looking out at the land he had called home for over 3 decades. The house had been added onto several times over the years. The barn was bigger, the corrals more numerous, but the essence of the place remained the same. It was still the refuge he had built with his own hands, now enriched beyond measure by the family that filled it. Eleanor came out to join him, moving a bit more slowly these days but still strong and capable. She slipped her hand into his and they stood together in the morning light. "You have any regrets?" she asked him. Dalton thought about the question seriously. He thought about the family he had lost to cholera, about the years of loneliness, about the hard times and struggles. But then he thought about Eleanor, about their children and grandchildren, about the life they had built together. "No," he said finally, "I do not have any regrets. Everything I went through led me to that dusty road where I found you, and finding you was worth everything that came before." "I feel the same way," Eleanor said. "I went through hell, but it brought me here to you, to this life. I would not change any of it." They celebrated his birthday with a big family gathering, the house full of children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren. There was food and music and laughter. Dalton sat in his chair, watching it all, Eleanor beside him, and felt his heart might burst from happiness. As evening fell and the family began to depart for their own homes, Daniel approached his parents. He was 40 now, with silver threading through his dark hair, looking more like his father every year. "Pa, Ma," he said, "I want you to know how grateful I am for everything you taught me. About the land, about family, about what really matters in life." Dalton clasped his son's shoulder. "You have made me proud, son, more proud than I can say." "Me too," Eleanor added, embracing Daniel. "You are a good man, a good husband, a good father, everything we could have hoped for." After everyone had left and they were alone, Dalton and Eleanor prepared for bed. It was a ritual they had performed thousands of times, comfortable and familiar. As they lay together in the darkness, Eleanor's head on his shoulder, Dalton felt a profound sense of completion. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" Eleanor asked. "For saying yes when I asked you to marry me, for building this life with me, for giving me a family, for loving me." "Thank you for seeing me that day," Eleanor replied, "for not just riding past, for giving me your boots and carrying me home, for loving me when I thought I was unlovable." "You were always lovable," Dalton said. "You were always extraordinary. I just saw what was already there." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms as they had done for 30 years. The house settled around them, full of memories and love, a testament to what two people could build when they found each other. The seasons continued their endless cycle. Spring brought new calves and the awakening of Eleanor's garden. Summer meant long days of work and short evenings of rest. Fall brought the roundup and preparing for winter. Winter meant quiet days by the fire, family gatherings, and the piece of snow-covered land. Through it all, Dalton and Eleanor remained the center of their family, the foundation upon which everything else was built. Their love story became legend in the area, the tale of the rancher who gave his boots to a barefoot woman and found his soulmate. Young couples would sometimes visit, asking for advice on marriage and life. Dalton's answer was always simple: find someone you respect and admire, someone who makes you want to be better, and then work every day to deserve their love. Eleanor's advice was equally straightforward. Marry someone who sees you, really sees you, and loves what they see. Someone who will give you their boots when yours are worn out. As they entered their late 60s, Dalton and Eleanor finally began to slow down considerably. The children insisted they take it easier, let the younger generation handle more of the work. They agreed, though sometimes reluctantly. But even in their slower pace, there was joy. They took walks together around the ranch, moving at a leisurely pace, pointing out changes and remembering earlier times. They sat on the porch for hours, just enjoying each other's company. They visited with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, passing on stories and wisdom. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching yet another Colorado sunset, Eleanor turned to Dalton with a soft smile. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night?" she asked. "When you gave me your boots." "I said you were safe," Dalton replied. "That you did not have to be afraid anymore." "And I was safe," Eleanor said. "From that moment on I was safe, not just from Calvin or the world, but safe to be myself. Safe to love and be loved, safe to dream and hope again. You gave me that." "You gave me the same thing," Dalton said. "You made me feel alive again. You made me want to build something, create something, leave something behind. Before you, I was just existing. After you, I was living." As the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Dalton pulled Eleanor close. They sat together in comfortable silence, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a lifetime of love. The years had been kind to them in the end. Yes, there had been struggles and hardships. Yes, there had been moments of fear and uncertainty. But through it all, they had each other. And that had made all the difference. As stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Dalton thought about the young man he had been, riding his horse down a dusty road outside Auray all those years ago. He thought about the decision to stop, to help, to give a stranger his boots. It had seemed like such a small thing at the time, barely worth thinking about, just basic human decency. But that small act of kindness had changed everything. It had led to love, to family, to a life richer than he had ever imagined possible. It had saved two people who desperately needed saving, and from that salvation, a whole family had grown. "What are you thinking about?" Eleanor asked, sensing his reflective mood. "About how the smallest acts can have the biggest consequences," Dalton said. "About how taking off my boots for a stranger led to all of this." Eleanor smiled. "It was not just the boots, you know. It was the man who gave them. It was your kindness, your compassion, your strength. That is what saved me. The boots were just a symbol." "Maybe," Dalton conceded, "but they were good boots." Eleanor laughed, the sound still bright and young despite her years. "Yes, they were, though they were terribly too big for me. You made them work. I always did what I had to do." We both did. As night fully settled over the valley, they finally went inside. The house was quiet now, just the two of them, but it still felt full. Full of memories, full of love, full of the life they had created together. In the years that followed, Dalton and Eleanor grew older but never apart. They remained devoted to each other until the very end, their love a constant in a changing world. They watched their family grow and flourish, knowing that they had created something that would last long after they were gone. When Dalton finally passed away at the age of 73, surrounded by his family, his hand was clasped in Eleanor's. His last words were simple: "Thank you for walking down that road." Eleanor lived another 5 years, still strong and capable, helping with the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, tending her beloved garden. When her time came, she went peacefully in her sleep, a smile on her face. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a cottonwood tree they had planted together 40 years earlier. The headstone was simple, bearing their names and dates and one line: "Love endures." The ranch continued to thrive under Daniel's care and eventually passed to his children. The story of Dalton and Eleanor became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. The tale of how a lonely rancher saw a woman walking barefoot in the dust, gave her his boots, and carried her home. Of how that simple act of compassion had led to a love that lasted a lifetime, and created a legacy that would endure for generations. In the end, it was a story about kindness, about seeing someone in need and choosing to help, about looking past yourself and your own concerns to recognize another person's humanity, about love that grows from respect and compassion into something deep and lasting. It was a story about two broken people who found each other and became whole, about building something beautiful from nothing, about family and legacy and the power of choosing love over loneliness. And it all started on a dusty Colorado road in the summer of 1878, when Dalton Nash saw Eleanor Foster walking barefoot through the dust, took off his boots, and carried her home. That single act of kindness changed two lives and created ripples that would extend far into the future, touching hundreds of lives over the decades. The ranch still stands today, still in the Nash family, a testament to what Dalton and Eleanor built together. And on quiet evenings, when the sun sets behind the mountains and the valley grows peaceful, some say you can still feel their presence there, walking hand in hand through the land they loved, their love as enduring as the mountains themselves.